What's going on, everybody? My name is Nick.
And my name is Dave.
And this is the Deep Dive, and we have started a brand new series. And this is going to be a long series, isn't it?
It's a 5-weeker.
A 5-week, and it's
Yeah.
called The Space Between Us. The sermon from Sunday that we're going to be talking about today was called?
Our imperfect relationships. Kind of looking at conflict resolutions. We're going to have conflict. We'll break it all down.
We'll break
It'll
it down.
Be all good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So join us, will you?
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, Dave, anything exciting from the weekend happen for you?
I know I'm doing just fine if I can get my microphone adjusted so that I can see
All
you.
these things we're supposed to prep beforehand.
I know.
Before recording. No, just
I know.
joking.
Yeah. How about you? How you doing? What's your
Pretty
bright spot?
good.
What's your bright spot today,
My
buddy?
bright spots. Actually, my bright spot would have to do with my leg. I finally got an all clear basically on my leg.
All right.
So I have my next step is to get some compression stockings I'll have to wear for a little while. But, everything on my leg they're saying look good to just kind of be able to get unwrapped and stuff like that. So hopefully by the end of the week, I won't have to have a wrap on anymore.
Yeah. Well, good.
So I'm excited about that. And,
Nice.
Just easy going this
Hey,
weekend.
Yeah, me too. I'm in a fairly good mood, and
I like that.
Things are going pretty good, and so yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
why don't we just go ahead and jump straight into the sermon then? Talk to us a little bit about what you talked about Sunday.
Well, let's talk about the series first, and I mean I think it's an important series as we sit down in worship planning, kind of look at blocks of time and what to preach on, and I've been excited for a while for this series. I knew it was coming up, kind of coming back into this time of year when things are starting back up and looking at our relationships and how we do life together. There's a lot of conflict and people kind of being apart,
Sure.
in various parts of their lives, and from politics to families to wherever. And so looking at 5 different series on 5 different topics, although they all kind of overlap, just looking at the space between us, the things that happen that cause relationships to be estranged or to be difficult. And so we began this week with the first one, which was titled, I think, Our Imperfect Relationships.
Yep.
And really, as I began the sermon, I wanted to stress to people is that everybody has imperfect relationships.
Yes.
That's just the nature of human beings. And I kind of looked a little bit at some old sitcoms, had some footage from old sitcoms in the sermon bumper, because I think there used to be sort of this perception that you got from watching, say, Leave It to Beaver or Father's Knows Best, or even in the 80s and some of those sitcoms like Family Ties, where, problems would happen, but first of all, they weren't really huge problems or complex problems, and they were solved within 30 minutes.
Right.
And I think that you could take away from that is that, my family's really messed up. This is the way families ought to be. This is the idealistic way, or the ideal families. And we have, I think the modern equivalent of that is the way we present ourselves on social media, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You get those posts, and, it's, people have probably taken 3 or 4 selfies to get the right just one, and they've gone in.
Perfect angle.
Yeah, put the filter in, and here's your kids all completely dressed up and going off to the first day of school, and nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we can tend to look at that and say, well, everybody else's family's doing pretty good except mine.
Yeah.
Or, and we can bring it into other parts of our lives too, like extended family or neighborhoods or churches.
Sure.
Or work relationships, that sort of things. And the truth is that conflict is inevitable.
Yeah.
We're going to have conflict.
Yeah. I think it's important to note, how much society does look at even just popular TV shows and kind of just gets this mindset of this is how life should be. Whether it was the Brady Bunch or whatever, where
Right.
they might have some subtle conflicts here and there, but at the end of the day, you knew all of them were going to wrap their arms around each other and charge forward. And life doesn't always seem like that. And I think what you said about social media, even jumping into that, is it's very true. And I know even sometimes I'll even think about it. You see these families going on their 3rd vacation to Disney in a year or something. You're like, am I missing the boat here? Or taking pictures, you're taking holiday pictures and it takes 100 shots to get that one where everybody else is like, they look like a Picasso off to the side, or they're staring at the dog,
are everybody smiling in the picture and not grimacing at
exactly
one of the others.
So like it just takes forever, but you're like, everybody shut up and listen. We got to get this one shot. Everybody pay close attention for 1 second, and then you get in and you're like, okay, now do whatever you want. I don't even care. Like chaos re-ensues.
Yeah, there's a Modern Family episode where they're all going to be dressed in white.
Yeah.
And it's just like the assembling of getting them all there together, and there's all these fights going on. And then finally you see the finished picture, and it's this beautiful picture.
I feel like I've seen that at like weddings and stuff, especially where it's like, where's the groom's dad or whatever, they're just like yelling and people are like, he's never here. And then all of a sudden it's like,
yeah.
So,
and so that topic about how we present ourselves on social media is actually going to show back up in a later sermon as we look at envy and the comparison and that sort of stuff. But this week, focusing on those relationships. And I think it does, and we could talk some about this, it does bleed over into our church life. And I think churches have historically been really bad about having sort of your church face that you put on Sundays, and that everything's all right, that, and usually kind of churchy language, and not really being real with one another. And I really am kind of a little bit of at a loss as to why we've done such a bad job with that. If church ought to be a place where it's safe to be yourself and to be real and to come, because we're all broken people.
Right.
And we've all got things to overcome. And a church is a place where we should come, and with the help of our Christian brothers and sisters and the help of looking at Scripture for guidance, we can find a better way.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
I definitely think that's, the goal. I feel like anytime you get a group of people together for long enough, there's always going to try to be like this hierarchy of good or whatever that just seems to pop up. It's almost like we revert back to that like elementary school days where it's like, okay, well, you're the cool kids and stuff like people just bubble to the surface and stuff like that. And I don't agree with that, especially in a church context, because like I feel like if we're really coming to God to worship, we're laying it all down, and it shouldn't be about a show of personality or I don't care if you are having the best time of your life or the worst time of your life, that we should be able to come together and be able to support, love, pray, laugh, and enjoy one another.
Come as you are, how you are on that day. But, and this is, again, all of these topics are related, but this week we're looking at gossip, because if somebody is going through a difficult time, then churches have been too guilty of like talking about those people, and so it sort of pushes us into this sort of space of being not real with one another. And, I guess so I give a disclaimer here about this series and even the conversation that we're having here, although that we can go deeper than, you can in 20 minutes on Sunday morning. It is that I don't want to give this idealistic, that I'm going to give you these 3 things and you do these and all your problems are going to go away. Because life is difficult, relationships are difficult. And but there is an idealism that we can find in the Christian faith, in the Scripture, of, this is the ideal of how, we should live our life, and forgiving one another, for example. I mean, we should forgive one another, but it's easier said than done lots of times. There's baggage and stuff around that. So all of this stuff's going to come out. We'll have lots to talk about here in the next 4 or 5 weeks as we unpack this stuff. And so looking at the Scripture, though, as our example, and you start looking at the major characters in the Bible, and they're filled with places where there was relational strife. I mean, beginning with Adam and Eve, but certainly Cain and Abel. But you look at Joseph and his brothers. His brothers sold him into slavery, and then they're very complex relationships that go on. Even David, he had a son who tried to kill him and opposed him. And I mean, all these people that we project as biblical heroes, yet they had relational strife. Sure. So how did they get through it? And we get to the New Testament, and one of the scriptures I pointed out on Sunday was, we think about Jesus being perfect, and Jesus was perfect, but his family, less than so at times. And so there's this scripture, that I pointed out on Sunday, where Jesus is, teaching somewhere in this house, and his family comes to get him, and they're saying he's lost his mind. And so who was his family? Well, I'm not, it doesn't mention them by name, but, if his mother and brothers and sisters were there, then that would include Mary and James, his brother, who ended up being a leader in the local church. And so even within these people that God used in great ways, there is stress in relationships. And so one of the key scriptures I looked at was from Acts 15, and I like that chapter because it deals with both sort of institutional conflict as well as personal conflict. Right. And it's Paul and Barnabas, and they're in a place called Antioch, which was an area that had a lot of Gentiles, a lot of people maybe who were practicing pagan religions or other religions. And they go there to start a church, and it starts doing fantastic. I mean, incredible things are happening. Miracles are happening. People are giving their lives to the Lord. And so what happened in the local churches in those days is they would send out like missionaries to go and preach, visiting preachers, that sort of things. And so a couple of folks came up from Jerusalem, and they were not liking that they were not following the Jewish law. Which because they were all Gentiles, and so they hadn't been circumcised but there are other parts of the Jewish law, but that was a big one for the males. Yeah. And they were saying, you cannot be a Christian, and that's actually almost a quote, you cannot be a Christian unless you were circumcised. Well, Paul and Barnabas get into a debate with them, and what they decide to do, and this part is, I feel like this early church handled conflict pretty well. They decide they're going to meet with the elders back in Jerusalem and discuss this. And so Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem, and they meet, and James is one of the people there. Right. And they heard the testimony, and they saw the miracles and what was happening. They said, okay, these people were out of line if they told you that. You certainly are Christians. These people certainly are Christians, and we're going to write a letter to that effect. And so James crafts a letter, and he sends it, back to this church. And it, I don't want to go into it because I really think all that was good and healthy. Yeah. But what is kind of interesting to me is he did include in this letter, you don't have to be circumcised, but here's 2 or 3 other things that you should be doing, and they're part of the Jewish law, And so you see sort of their theology evolving of what it means to have right standing with God, where it used to be keeping the law, and now it's faith alone in Jesus Christ. Yeah. And other people have tacked on other things like, well, you have to be baptized or you can't be saved, and stuff like that. And so it's interesting to see that they were still struggling with, what it meant to be a Christian. Yeah. So anyway, you would think for Paul and Barnabas, a pretty big win, right? Right. They went up, they stood up for their people.
They got the letter of approval.
They got the letter. This part's going good, and I think that when we could break that down is a pretty good way in this sort of institutional or this faith community of handling conflict. Right. And there's a lot of things that we could point to in going directly to the person, speaking, giving your case. The people responding, not in judgment, but with a sense. Open mind, and so a lot of good parts of that. But then at the very end of the chapter, and I'm so glad, this is what's so cool about the Bible, that this is included. Yeah, is you had this big falling out with Paul and Barnabas over this guy named John Mark. John Mark, when he'd been very young, there was a missionary journey that he had gone with Paul and Barnabas on. And it got pretty rough. I think there was a shipwreck or something. I can't remember the exact circumstances, but he decided to leave and go back home. Yeah. He was a young guy, Paul looked at that very harshly. Barnabas thought he should have a second chance, and they split ways. This is where Paul and Barnabas broke up. Their conversation gets so heated, they break up. And Paul and goes his way. He takes Silas with him, and John Mark and Barnabas go off. And God used that.
Yeah.
God used that, but yet you see that it was a very real. And so when we have falling outs with people, and maybe even there's a divorce that happens, or there's a people that used to be very close with one another, but something happens to fracture that relationship. I don't know if that's God's ideal, but it happens.
Yeah.
And I don't want to set that up as an example for us. Hey, we should do that.
Right.
But is to say, it's okay.
Yeah.
Your relationships aren't perfect.
Right.
But it's okay.
Yeah.
So, how can we do better? That's the question. That's the
I think that is the question.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting when you talk about like how they ended up splitting, and because I think sometimes, especially in times of conflict, we're almost so fixated on winning the argument or winning the battle that we like just we'll re-engage. We'll try to like, oh, you just have to see my side or whatever. That maybe sometimes being apart and just being like that whole handshake, agree to disagree, sometimes might be the way to go, and say like, we're just
right.
Maybe this isn't good for us to be here right now.
And so I guess to give that sort of cautionary tale is that I do think not to be idealistic, because I think also the church, and maybe in outside life too, that we say, well, just get back together or just get over it. And this is to say that this doesn't always happen, but I do think there is an idealism that the Bible speaks to of how we should treat one another. Sometimes there's too much water under the bridge. But so looking at it, first of all, and I think you were hitting on it, we're so focused on winning that we don't listen to the other person.
Yeah.
And so one of the first points I made was actually you can find it in the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, but also the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that famous book. But it is to seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Yeah.
Whether you ever end up agreeing with that person or not, I think it's important for us to listen and to hear and to try to understand their sides. We don't know their story or all their story. We don't know their motivations. We don't know what kind of day they've had, what kind of history. We don't know. There may be circumstances we don't know. But if we're so determined and on the charge that we're not listening, then we are headed for a cliff of division and estrangement.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the first steps that we take is that little simple step. Very simple, hard to do.
Yeah.
Seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because I think oftentimes we're really bad at assuming what other people think or how they feel or whatever. So we're assuming that they might be coming into this in either the most positive light or negative light, because even sometimes in relationships, like, I think you and me have a good relationship. So I will always assume that you're coming from the best spot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Until you prove to me that I can't assume that. You know what I mean? Well, on the flip side, if somebody's hurt me enough, I'm always going to assume they're coming from the worst possible side.
100%.
You know what I mean? But to stop and to try to actually understand is taking maybe those preconceived biases or whatever and say, okay, let me hear you for what you're saying.
Right.
As opposed to, you've hurt me in the past, or we're in really good standing or whatever, but let me try to find out exactly where we're at so we can make whatever the most logical decision
Right on.
is.
I mean, that's such an excellent point, because we do know each other. We work together very closely.
Yeah.
And so we might be in a meeting somewhere, and I may say something that might sound like something to somebody else, or even, on its face values could be misinterpreted.
Right.
And, my guess would be you would say, no, that's not exactly what he meant.
Yeah.
So we can have that sort of things. Or even if you said something to me, if we were talking one-on-one. Right. And, well, I'm not, you'd ask clarifying questions. Is this what you really meant? Is this what you really believe?
Because I know generally where you stand on those things.
That's a
or
relationship
whatever.
heart. So but that does lead into an important point that I was making in the sermon, and that has to do with some stuff that I got from family systems theory. So I'll let you know where I've got it. But has to do with like the conflicts that we have. There's like substantive is the word it uses in that book.
Yeah.
A substantive conflict. And that is where there's a relationship. The relationship's so important with a person. And it may be something as, light as where we're going to lunch today. Go to Chinese, you want to go to the hibachi place,
Right.
you want to go to the Mexican place. And so there's a conflict, there's a disagreement. You want to go one place, I want the other place. But it's not going to hurt our relationships.
Right.
And there's this sort of this mutuality is like, well, you choose this time, I'll choose that time.
Right.
And so, but, and you could like look at something a little bit more serious. Let's say you're in a boardroom with people you've worked with a lot, and we're working on a budget together, and you may have an opinion that money needs to be spent here, and I maybe have an opinion that money needs to be spent there.
Yeah.
And yet there's this mutuality that and actually it ends up being a good thing because we get to a stronger decision together.
Right.
Okay, so that's that. Then there's what you referred to in just a second with the emotional thing.
Yeah.
That because of either a relationship with that person or a person that person reminds you of experience that we have, there's some emotion that we bring into it, where we've been hurt, where we feel we've been bullied or put down or not heard,
Right.
and there's that sort of the emotional things that are going on. And the point that the book makes is a good one, is that it's rarely one or the other. It's some combination. So even if you're talking about something that is, in fact, just a thing, a substantive thing like a budget or whatever, if there's emotion involved, it can get really entangled.
Yeah.
And really depending on how much and how long that's going on.
And it's near impossible to remove emotion from the equation.
Right, we're emotional people.
And
It's going to be part
exactly.
of those things.
Even if it's
Yeah.
the emotion of happiness or success, like there's always going to be some piece of that in us. It's the same reason why you could say something to an individual. You could say the exact same thing 2 different days, and it could be received 2 totally different ways. One day, I might pick on you with a joke or something like that
Right.
about like, oh, that shirt looks, I don't
You're wearing a pink shirt today. What's up with that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, haha. But the next thing you might be like, why do you even care? You know
Right.
what I mean? Like, I want to wear what I want to wear. Leave me alone. Like, it's just kind of sometimes emotions play so far into it. And we need to recognize that we need to have that space, and probably back to the original or the first point you made is have that place of understanding, because our emotions can sometimes cloud the logic side of it.
Yeah.
But that's increasingly hard to do.
But it is, and we are emotional creatures, and
Yeah.
and so we bring into that what's happened that day or some other history.
Yeah.
I have met people. I'll confess to this. I've met people for the first time, and I'm shaking hands with them, and I'm not. I mean, this is like a bias that I'm not even aware of, and
Sure.
I'm going like, I'm not going to ever like this person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's based on somebody else, and then lots of times once I've got to know that person, I find out that we're not. We're a lot more alike, and I end up liking that person. But
Yeah.
we bring in those biases into things that are emotions, and so when everything is just fine and dandy and there's nothing to have conflict, but the first time there's a disagreement on something,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about like words that we use and perceptions and asking clarification stuff later on in the series.
Sure.
But it's just starting with this groundwork is, we are going to have conflict.
Yeah.
And I think the self-awareness of realizing where are we on this thing. I am really, really disagreeing with what this person is saying.
Yeah.
And what's that about? Is it the issue at hand, or it's the way that they have treated me in the past, or someone else treated me in the past, or that I've had a bad day today?
Ongoing strings of things that have happened that maybe
like
have put you
it's
somewhere.
like the fifth thing. Yeah, like you've seen like a $100 response to a $10 problem before.
Yeah.
And like, what was up with that?
Right.
But it's just built up and built up and built up, and finally it just exploded.
Yeah.
And then that person feels like, well, people are looking at me and thinking petty, but they don't understand this history
Everything that went into it.
that went into it. So relationships are tough.
Relationships are tough, and something. I don't know if you're going to get into this in another part of the series or whatever, but as we seek to like understand the relationships and how to have healthy relationships, something I would encourage you guys to do if you've never done it is look at the Enneagram,
Right.
the test and
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
and the study, because I think it helps you understand yourself, but also other people around you, because it basically, it's not unlike the DISC assessment, or there's a lot of these like behavioral assessments that kind of tell you where you align. But one thing I like about the Enneagram is that it kind of shows you get listed a number, and there's this kind of overall arch. Like I'm a 9, which is titled a peacemaker. So my main goal is to keep peace and stuff like that. And sometimes I will minimize myself in the hopes that I can keep peace. You know what I mean? But there's also like side numbers that you're kind of attributed to where like if you're healthy, you might go into this other side where like, if you're in a healthy spot, you're feeling good, you might really jump more into a leadership space. Or when you're unhealthy, like when you're upset or life has hit you really hard and you're stressed, you might go to this other number. And so it kind of gives you 2 or 3 numbers that all have these titles that you might be in certain emotion states and stuff like that. And I think I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast before, but we did it as a staff.
Yeah.
And I think there were some like eye-opening pieces because we had quite a bit of 9s.
Yeah.
We had a couple 7s, and then we had a couple sprinkled, like I think
4.
Nick was a 5, and I think Nicole was like a 2 or something like that. But I think it was you. Like you kind of had this like space in the middle of it and realized like, oh, I'm kind of like, I'm a dreamer. I have a lot of ideas.
Right.
But that can drive the 9s
Well, it's
crazy when there's, when they're looking for solutions and how to fix things and stuff like that. And it was like, oh, so these places where maybe conflict could start or originate, now that I have an understanding, I know what I can do a little bit better to prevent that.
And realizing that the way people process things is different from one
Yeah.
another. And like if there is a conflict going on, some people want to charge in, let's sit down and we need to talk about this right now.
Yeah.
Other people are like, I just need some space.
Right.
Right now, I'm too upset to talk about it. I need to back off, and
Yeah.
I'll be better later. And the other person's like, we're never going to get there unless we talk about it now.
Yeah.
And so, I think that self-awareness of ourselves, because sometimes there has to be compromise
Right.
with that, But I think, if we have this sort of mutual understanding, is we want to get to the best things, so we need to allow people to have, yes, it's important to talk about.
Yeah.
But can we agree when we're going to sit down and talk about it? Because I'm just not going to be into it right now.
Right.
It's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
And so sometimes just simple communications with that.
And I think the beauty of that, especially when you're talking about conflict, is if you understand yourself, you can even avoid some conflict because you know how you'll respond and be able to set up some of those barriers and those boundaries. But I also think if you're able to know the other person and kind of know where they're coming from, that might give you more understanding, as we talk about that, is instead of, just jumping to assumptions and stuff
Sure.
like that. And
Yeah.
and I would just encourage, like, I think as Dave said, this isn't like a 3-part sermon thing where we could say this, and this will fix all your relationships.
Right, yeah.
But, I think there are some things, I think like personally, I would say the Enneagram, I think is a good way to at least try to understand yourself. You know what I mean? So to take that and say like, this might be something practical I can try and learn from, and that will help in some of these spaces. They might not clear everything up forever, for sure, but that's a practical part.
It is a very practical part, and it's very important. I think anytime we can grow in self-awareness.
Sure.
And I do think we do need to have this goal of the high idealism that is following Jesus Christ.
Right.
In Wesleyan theology, we as Methodists are, follow sort of that strain of theology that goes through. John Wesley talked about sanctification. He actually had a word for it, Christian perfection. And I just think lots of times we're not comfortable with that, but he's being perfected in love.
Right.
But that there is this idealism, that there is a better way.
Yeah.
We fall so terribly short of it. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up, completely when we fall short of it. Neither do I think we should say, well, I'm just a human being and that's just the way it is. This relationship's over.
Right.
I do think we can do better.
Yeah.
I think there does come a time when it is good to set a boundary, and relationships maybe don't need to be together on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
But as human beings, we do have to interact with one another. So, I mean, that's a whole.
There's a lot of sides.
There's a whole ball of stuff there to unpack later. But just to kind of bring this to a close, because I know I'm looking at the clock here. We're getting up to 30 minutes. We went way too long last week.
Yeah.
We're not going to do that this week. But it is that it landed on it. I'm going to do an entire sermon on this, but it ends up on forgiveness.
Yeah.
Jesus, I'll just give the one key verse that I ended the sermon with, and that Jesus in preaching one time talks about whatever you ask for in prayer, believing you will receive. We love that part,
Yeah.
but we don't go on to that next verse. And the next verse, when you stand in prayer, when you're standing there praying, and you realize you have something, there's some estrangement between you and another person, go to that person and ask for forgiveness. And so I think those two things go together. If we're going to grow in prayer, grow in being more like Jesus, we have to also understand that that's going to involve sort of self-surrender. Now, does that mean that we become doormats and let people walk all over us? Is that what I mean by forgiveness? Absolutely not. I don't want to give that perception.
Right.
But there is this sort of release to be our best person that involves forgiving the other person who's harmed us.
Sure.
So, much more about that later.
Is that next week or is that down the road?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
This week we're talking about gossip.
Okay. Ooh.
So, yeah.
Fun.
Know any good gossip?
I don't have any right. Actually, I might, but I won't say it on camera. They'd probably fight me. But yeah, I like my tea. As Rachel would say, she's always like, "Fill my cup. What's the tea?"
Yeah.
But
it's another struggle.
Get there.
Gossip can be. I mean, because we have relationships, we have to talk. But how can it be like? It can be incredibly destructive.
Yeah.
The Bible has actually a lot to say about gossip.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of unpack why is it that we're so drawn to it? What's so appealing about it? And I think that's sort of that self-awareness thing. If we kind of understand, like, first of all, why it's so appealing to us, but at the same time realize how much of a powder keg it can be.
Sure.
Then I think we can do better.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, as we are kind of approaching, if not past that time, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for being here week in and week out. Always means a lot to us because, we're still hitting, that 150 view mark. People are interacting in spaces, so we thank you guys for that. So if you don't know how to, the comments on the YouTube, the Facebook, wherever you're watching this, you can always shoot us an email. If you have our phone numbers, drop us a text, whatever it is. We'd love to be in communication with you guys about it. But again, thanks for watching. Dave, you got anything to add here at the last minute?
No, I'm good. Just hope to see you this Sunday. God bless everybody.
Yep.
And love one another and forgive one another.
There you go.
Yeah.
We'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.